Hello and welcome to another episode of Inside DevOps. I'm your host, John Bristowe, and joining me on this show is Alan Shreve, who's the CEO and founder of ngrok, or Network Grok. I guess you guys just think of it as ngrok now. So, Alan, thanks for joining me on the show. I really appreciate it.
It's so great to be here. Thanks for having me, John.
Yeah, so we've been using ngrok at Octopus for a while now. We're huge fans. Most developers, I think you have a solid following of developer fans who are loyal to using ngrok, which is awesome. Ngrok, if you haven't used it before, it's a great tool as part of your development workflow. But for folks who maybe not have heard of it, maybe let's give them the sort of elevator pitch on what ngrok is and how it works.
Yeah, ngrok is a Ingress platform as a service. So ngrok is about taking your work, your application, and putting it on the internet, whether that's an application that is running on your laptop or one that's running in AWS on a Kubernetes cluster in Heroku. It really doesn't matter. Ngrok is about creating that secure ingress to your application. You can think of it like a globally distributed reverse proxy as a service, where you can then leverage ngrok to put authentication, observability, resiliency primitives in front of your application. Um, One of the ways that we like to think about ngrok is that it's kind of like a mech suit that you like put your application in that like gives it superpowers by wrapping it with protection and auth and a whole bunch of other niceties. So really excited about using ngrok as a way to accelerate developers, right? Having them I think a lot of developers will, it resonates that you rebuild a lot of things for a lot of applications that you deploy. You rebuild auth, you rebuild rate limiting, you rebuild concurrency limiting, a whole bunch of things that we're looking to like extract out into that proxy layer and help you avoid having to rebuild them all the time.
Yeah, the story behind ngrok is fascinating to me because it sounds very much similar to. I talked to Eric Lawrence, the creator of Fiddler, and he told me a similar story. His story is he's talked a lot about. He was on the clip art team for Office back in the day, many moons ago, and clip art was a service. It was this really bad sort of list of images you could incorporate into Office. They were horrible, but he was a member of the team and needed a way to basically trace what was happening on the wire, and he created Fiddler out of necessity. And ngrok has a similar story. You were at Twilio, and you were really like trying to do a lot of webhook development, base development, and trying to send your application messages. And basically, you came up with this implementation for a service that was already built out there, local tunnel. I'm telling the story a little bit. Why don't you share with folks the story behind the motivation for this?
You're doing such a good job, John. Yeah, I mean, ngrok's genesis can be traced to a number of different things. Definitely, my time at Twilio is one of them, um, where we were doing this webhook development all the time, and you would like sit and like type the same text message into your phone over and over again, just to, like have the same callback come back to your machine. Um, as well as like the fact that like you usually had to like deploy your service that you wanted to test somewhere out in the world, which is also a really slow iterative cycle. So that was the genesis of where ngrok came from, was simplifying that developer flow of being able to receive traffic from the world on something that you're working on your local machine. These days, though, we've expanded that vision, greatly beyond where ngrok started to basically be around ingress to anything. It's not just ingress to things that are running on your laptop. It's ingress to services that are running on your Raspberry Pi, ingress to things that are running in your production Kubernetes cluster, in AWS or GCP or an on-prem data center. It really doesn't matter. So that's kind of when I talk about ngrok being as a service, that's really what I mean, is that it extracts it out so that the place where you're forwarding traffic to becomes kind of like unportable, right? From the standpoint of receiving ingress.
Yeah, I've always thought of ngrok as a great at shortening the development cycle. For software developers like myself, it's like, there's the statement we use a lot, which is, and I know you've talked about that, you've grown beyond that vision, but for me, I still think of ngrok as like, we always have that statement within development teams, like it works on my machine. And so the way I look at ngrok is like, it's a way of saying, well, here you go. I'll prove it to you that it works on my machine, and I can expose to you basically the service or application I want, in a sense, publicly in a secure manner. So, is, and you've grown beyond that vision now. So is it still used in the traditional space? Like, what are some of the customer scenarios you've seen used with your customers around ngrok, and where do you see that model evolving to?
So ngrok, you're right that ngrok has moved beyond that space. That's not to say that we don't think it's very important and spend a lot of time thinking about it. We do. What we found was that a lot of developers who were using ngrok on their local machine started saying like, "Well, this is really easy, and when I take it to production, like then I have to invent a whole bunch of new stuff. I have to stand up like a whole bunch of infrastructure. Like, why isn't it just that easy in production?" And that's really like the way that ngrok has transitioned to becoming this production platform, is bringing that same simplicity of an application running on your machine that has, ingress from the internet, should be just as simple out in the production world. Now, obviously, you want all sorts of like configuration knobs to secure it and lock it down in appropriate ways to protect it from attacks. Um, but all of those things are essentially the pieces that we're building into that same exact like simplified experience. So you were asking about use cases. We've seen, when you're moving into the production space, this means like we're talking about folks hosting production APIs with ngrok, hosting production web applications with ngrok, right? Your like public website, uh, your production webhook consumers, right? If you're like testing, like I'm getting Slack webhooks on my local machine. Like when you deploy that service to production, like if ngrok is still fronting it, ngrok should be able to receive that traffic and provide it to your application in production way. Um, we've also seen it like deployed on IoT devices all around the world, as ways of creating ingress to APIs or other network services that live on those IoT devices and providing that level of connectivity. And then last is kind of like replacing layer four networking in many ways for like things like VPNs, especially between customers, is not really the right abstraction that folks wanted to be working at. And ngrok being a really easy way to create secured ingress between yourself and your customer by allowing the customer to run essentially like a very targeted ingress using one of ngrok's primitives that only the service provider can access.
Yeah, that's something that's often not talked about a lot when people talk about ngrok, at least from what I've seen on social media. And when I talk to developers, they often think about it as the just give me a means of exposing something internally, externally. But you have a lot of great facilities around, as you mentioned, security. And I think something that isn't talked a lot about, observability, which is very, very important as part of your testing, and you're making sure that things are standing up correctly and that you can see the inbound messages, that Ingress as a service facility. Is there more integration here that you're looking at? Is there additional sort of scenarios that customers are looking for, or are you looking to just add to the facilities that are in the product today?
I would say both, right? We're looking at new types of what we would call like middleware or modules of ways to manipulate or observe or secure the traffic that is transiting through ngrok to your application. And then, like you said, many of the pieces that we already have that manipulates that traffic, adding additional integrations to them. So a good example of that would be OAuth, which is something that we just made available on the free plan today, which is really exciting. So you can basically ask ngrok to front your application with Google or GitHub OAuth. And when we do that, basically ngrok runs that full OAuth flow for you. It allows you to specify which OAuth provider you want to communicate with. So like GitHub or Google or Microsoft or Facebook, even like social auth providers. We'll run that whole OAuth flow for you and then pass the access token, right? The API access token back to your upstream application in a header so that you can then call those APIs. We give you facilities to like restrict access with like email address and domain and things like that. But um, you know, we have a set of providers, but we're absolutely thinking about like how many more providers can we add.
This is awesome. I didn't realize that this was something you did. I'm being completely honest. I had no idea you guys supported OAuth, which is amazing. This is a hard problem because this is the reason why you're seeing all these libraries and frameworks and solutions from a variety of folks, including Auth0, et cetera, to just have these turnkey solutions. So the fact that you can just walk up and say dash dash OAuth equals whatever is fantastic. So That's awesome. I had no idea this was available.
Thanks. We're really proud of how easy we made it to do that. And we're really excited to add more providers. We think that, every OAuth provider in the world, you should be able to like basically like add a command line flag and then start integrating with them. You shouldn't have to like import libraries into your code or anything like that. It should just be like fully transparent to you.
Sorry, my head just went like this because like OAuth is so hard. It's like it's such a mind scrambler, especially when you're a developer. You're like, look, I don't care about this. Please, I've got to focus on my application. I've got a feature set. I got no time to do this. And the fact that you can just walk up and say, yeah, here you go, whack whack, or dash dash OAuth equals whatever, and then we front it with this ability. Now you'll have this ability to auth requests and see them obviously with the observability piece. So that's fantastic. I love that.
Yeah, you can like add the scopes that you want to ask for from the OAuth
Yeah, yeah.
provider, right? It's the problem is even really worse than that because OAuth, it is a framework as much as a protocol. So like when you do these like social auth pieces, like everyone, like the scopes that you have to specify, the errors that you interpret back, like everyone has like a little bit of a different twist on it. So it's not really something where you can just like use one single library and it just works. If you like go out and look at the libraries that people have built for different languages, they have like special cases for every single provider, right? It's one of the things that like OIDC was trying to standardize for you, of like bringing that identity layer to OAuth. But yeah, it's one of the things that we're really excited about, being able to like secure your applications in that way and enable you to build those integrations more easily.
Earlier, you had mentioned or highlighted the fact that integrations are a key component of ngrok. I am a firm believer in if you are part of any pipeline or workflow or anything like that, you've got to have integrations as a key feature. It's not just an afterthought. And your list of integrations is fantastic. Like you've got, and I know some of these are just basically parts and pieces of the plumbing, but it gives you these sort of turnkey solutions or recipes of how to integrate with solutions like if you're doing community management, you can do integration with Orbit webhooks, or if you're doing Azure AD, here's how you do it via with ngrok. So I think this is awesome. Like the fact that you've gone through the process of documenting and walking people through the steps of how to make this available is fantastic. What is your opinion around it? Am I alone in thinking that integrations isn't a high order bit, or do you guys view it the same way?
No, it's 100% a high order bit, right? It is a really tremendous way to allow people to connect like services that they're already using without having to like work with the raw primitives to do so. Like anything that we do as developers, we are building abstractions over complexity. And building these integrations rather, is another way that you abstract that complexity, right? By building these kind of like turnkey integrations.
Speaking of abstractions, you guys have a Terraform provider now. I know that it's under development, etc. But I did want to highlight it here because it is something that you talk about in your online marketing. So if we scroll down here, you can see on the page here you talk about a little bit, from development to production, and you mentioned the fact that you have a TF file here. So this is HCL. This is the ability to basically spin up ngrok supported endpoints, etc. Your provider, what is the capability of the provider today?
Yeah, that's exactly right. We're like ngrok is infrastructure for those who are, not like ngrok works in multiple ways. Like one is like I spin it up dynamically, but the other is like I'm exposing production services with it. So then it becomes part of your infrastructure. And if you're going to be infrastructure for companies, like the de facto way to do infrastructure as code these days is Terraform. And that's really why we built the provider, was to make all of our API resources available and configurable and provisionable via that Terraform provider. Fun fact about that Terraform provider: we're working on improving it, but one of the neat pieces of it is that we actually code generate most of the Terraform provider from our API resource definitions. Um, so it is one of the ways that we are able to like add new API resources and have them show up in the Terraform provider relatively quickly in a very standardized way.
Describe to me the process that you use for documenting, structuring your schema. Are you using JSON schema? Are you using Open API? Are you using Swagger? Like, what are you guys doing? And then how do you gen from there? Do you use the Go gen generation tools? Like, describe to me a little bit about what you guys do for that, if you don't mind.
Our format is an internal format. We use essentially like Our API is mostly defined in, is all defined in protobuf, more or less, with a set of custom annotations that describe our essentially like HTTP API. And from those set of definitions, we actually generate out the Terraform provider. We generate out all of our API client SDKs for every language is generated from that. Our public documentation for the API is generated from that as well. And the ngrok agent actually has a CLI embedded inside of it that allows you to make API calls to our API via our CLI. That's also fully generated from our API definitions as well. There are a few other things, I think. Our server side, actually, the server side stubs that you obviously can't see, we generate those from the definition as well to make sure that they're always in sync and correct. We have a pretty code generation heavy approach at ngrok. It is one of the ways that lets us scale our engineering team to move faster and generate, build more resources without someone having to manually go create each one of these touch points.
What's been your experience with cogen? Just out of curiosity, have you had a positive experience? I know that if it goes well, it can go really well, but sometimes if it goes badly, it can go really badly. We've experimented on our side with cogen. What's your thoughts and opinions on cogen at the moment?
I'm a big proponent of cogen. It has really great upsides, which is, at the end of the day, as developers, we are searching for leverage, right? That is what we do, is we build leverage, and cogen is one of the more powerful ways that you can create leverage as a developer. Um, it obviously has downsides, right? Or challenges, things to overcome, things like you know your pull requests may end up with like a whole bunch of code generated files that you don't want people to look at, and like how do you like make people realize that things are like really small and easy to review when a bunch of things are code generated. um, Taking like pull requests from a community when something is like code generated also becomes really challenging, right? Of like they don't have access to the code generator, and that can create some frustration. uh, I don't know. Like, there are a number of like pros and cons to it, but on the whole, we found really good, leverage and returns to scale from automating a number of things with code generation. At the end of the day, it's just like another primitive for automation, right?
Yeah, yeah, we looked at protocol buffers ourselves. We also looked at JSON schema, which JSON schema was really difficult to wrap our heads around. And there was a lot of twists and turns, and even the spec itself is still under a little bit of active development there. So at the end of the day, we just kind of threw up our hands and said, look, we're going to have to hand roll some of this stuff ourselves because the tools aren't there. So that's just interesting to hear your experience. You'd mentioned earlier integration with a variety of frameworks and libraries, et cetera, et cetera. We've talked about integrations. This is something that you recently blogged about, ngrok-go, ingress to your Go apps as a net.listener. I'm a huge fan of the network stack in Go, super pluggable, super performant, et cetera, et cetera. You know this yourself. Tell me a little bit about this. What is ngrok-go?
So ngrok-go, for those who have used ngrok before, is the ngrok agent packaged as a Go library. If you haven't used ngrok-go before, or sorry, if you haven't used ngrok before, the way you can think about it is uh, it is a library that you can import into your application that gives you a function call that looks just like in any language, like you would like listen on a local port, right? Like on a socket. It is a replacement for that, which instead of listening on a local port, it listens on all of ngrok's points of presence all around the world. But the thing that it returns to you is that exact same socket-like object. In Go, that's a net listener is the object that gets returned. And so, essentially what that means is that you can drop ngrok-go into any Go application that knows how to work with a net listener, which is the majority of them. It's like you said, Go's network stack is really well designed in that way. And when you do that, it allows you to basically have the application like start listening on ngrok's global edge. But unlike a local port, right, there are a couple of interesting things about it. One is like your application can only be reached through that endpoint if you don't have it listen on any other ways, which means there's no like way around it, which means that the authentication primitives that we can enforce for you are guaranteed, right? And when you create that listener, you can specify all the things that you want ngrok to do on your behalf in front of your application, like OAuth, like we were talking about earlier, um, or enforcing like layer 4 network policy of like which citers are allowed to speak to your application, or even resiliency primitives like circuit breaking, where if your application like starts returning 500s, that ngrok will basically like block traffic until it is able to like recover itself. So lots of primitives like that, but are baked into this single like I want a listener call.
Yeah, ngrok is extremely powerful when you start to get a sense of what it can do. And features like this are amazing because it gives you pluggability into a stack that you never had before. You have to roll this stuff or integrate it through third party libraries. But with ngrok now, like you said, you just basically establish it and you set up your configs and away you go. And suddenly it's like, yeah, give me GitHub. Yeah, give me, whatever. Give me X or Y, and it's amazing. And then you have this sort of global network that you have available for developers to target as well. This is fantastic.
Thanks. That global network is a really important piece of it. It's a really challenging thing to build. Where essentially, like when you're asking us to front your application with, OAuth or network policy, that is actually getting pushed out when you run the application to our entire global network. Essentially, like as soon as you start the application, like all of our points of presence around the world, like hot reload to pick up that new configuration. It means that all of those pieces essentially get run closer to your customers, right? So your application actually becomes faster because that stuff is getting pushed out to the global edge.
Yeah, this is the thing that really nails it home for me. The why question, and Ingress should be a high level abstraction. That nails it on the head for me right there, because it is, as it point rightly identifies, super frustrating. It is so frustrating to get this. As I said, you have to basically cobble together your Ingress, and this gives you now a pluggable aspect to your network stack for Go. The question I would obviously have is like, what else can I use ngrok for relative to other languages? Meaning, are you working on other languages, or are you supporting anything else beyond just having Go, for example?
We are absolutely working on other languages. We're the ones that are next in the queue right now are ngrok Rust and ngrok.js. So those are coming up, but other ones like .NET and C Sharp and things like Ruby and Python are not far behind. So we're actively thinking about all of those. You're 100% right that we built it because working with what we say internally at ngrok is that and it's even bolded here on the screen that we're looking at together right now, which is that when you're working with networking primitives today, you are working with the assembly language of networking. We haven't built the high layer abstractions that developers expect, right? Like we're missing the Python of the Python and Ruby of networking. That's really what we're trying to do, is create an interface and an abstraction for application developers to ask for what they want without having to think about a whole bunch of primitives like IP addresses and subnets and elastic IPs and DNS and certificates. Those are things that maybe you have a case where you want to customize them, but most people don't, right? And they're not the thing that they actually care about, which is like, I want a layer 7 address, a URL with these application primitives like put in front of my application. That's how an application developer should be thinking, right? That's how, like, when I'm in application developer mode, like that's what I want to be thinking about. And so that's the experience that we're really working on designing.
Yeah, the phrase that I often cite is "do as I mean, not what I say." And I think about, like, just give me the thing that I want and allow me to continue to do my job. Don't let me worry about all this sort of nuance and, like you said, the assembly language of networking. It's too low level at this point. So I think that's fantastic. Talk a little bit about Ingress should be environment independent.
Yeah, that's one of the really interesting things with ngrok-go and the other libraries that we're producing, and some of the other ways that we've created for you to use ngrok is that when you use ngrok, the ingress for your application becomes portable. When you use ngrok for ingress, you can run your application on GCP or AWS or your laptop or Raspberry Pi or a private data center or Heroku. It really doesn't matter. It gets Ingress in the same way because Ingress has been pulled out and abstracted into this service layer. That makes it a really powerful way to essentially you know, avoid work when you want to create something that is more environment independent. Right. If you're thinking about how to like create Ingress for your Raspberry Pi versus like your Kubernetes cluster on GCP or like an on-prem data center, those are like wildly different problems, right, to solve. And ngrok is a way to think about unifying those and simplifying them, allowing your application to be put in all of them in the same way from a networking standpoint, of course.
Now, obviously, the question will become the way that I think the industry at large is dealing with this notion of having portability is I often see two camps. There's the code first camp, and then there's the description language camp or the config language camp, which typically which typically aligns itself with things like YAML and such. You've gone obviously the code first approach. Do you feel like that's going to be the way forward, or do you think like at some point, like we talked about Terraform, um, do you feel like at some point in the future there might be some intermediary sort of language that you would load config from in this framework that you would just say, look, this is what I want? Or are you sticking with the code first approach?
I wouldn't actually say that we're code first. I would say that we have both code first and configuration first. One of the things that we haven't talked about is that in addition to something like ngrok-go, we are also actively working on building out the ngrok Kubernetes ingress controller. So this is a ingress controller that you can deploy into your Kubernetes environment, and then the thing that you publish to it is configuration, right? It's YAML definitions of those resources, of like how to create within the Kubernetes definitions of like an ingress object, how ingress should be created. But uh, it still has that same magical experience for you, which is that once you install the ingress controller into your Kubernetes cluster, you don't have to configure all of the IPs and DNS and routing to it. You don't have to give it access to the appropriate like NICs or network interfaces. Instead, it is essentially doing the same thing that ngrok-go or the ngrok agent is doing, which is reaching out to our global network and creating ingress that way. So you can essentially like install the ingress controller and create ingress for a mini queue that's running on your machine just as much as you can do it on GKE or EKS.
So you're dealing with obviously the way that which data comes into an application that's obviously deployed to Kubernetes. Ingress is obviously a tough problem. If you've seen your fair share of YAML files, you can get a sense of that very quickly. Are there other scenarios that ngrok is thinking about beyond what we've described already? So we've talked about Kubernetes, we've talked about custom applications. Are there other ingress scenarios that ngrok is considering?
Those are the main ones that are on our mind right now, are the ingress controller and the language integrations. We think that on top of the language integrations, like the language native SDKs, we're going to be building a lot of more integrations. Back to your point earlier of like those being like a truly powerful way to enable folks in the community to build more quickly. We expect that there will be some more that crop up in that way. At the end of the day, like from a product design philosophy, from a developer philosophy, you want to meet developers where they are. So for some developers, that means like they want APIs in their code. For some developers, that means like they want to configure through Terraform or through Kubernetes, right? Like in Ingress as infrastructure as code, or API resources defined as YAML in the case of Kubernetes. At the end of the day, ngrok is about creating, like our philosophy at ngrok is about creating the right primitives and abstractions, no matter where you are, no matter what set of interfaces or abstractions you're looking for, right? Because different developers and different applications really have different requirements in terms of like how much infrastructure you need to build around them.
One thing I did notice in your JS implementation for ngrok, you're utilizing a lot of Rust. So you've got 50% Rust, 45% JavaScript as part of the implementation for the agent for Node.js. What are your observations of Rust? Do you like it as a language, or do you see it as, like, I know you enjoy programming Go. Do you see yourself moving over to Rust more and more? There's this. I think there's a friendly co-opetition right now between the lobsters, or rather the crabs, and the gophers right now in terms of Rust versus Go. I'm a fan of Go, but I'm leaning more and more towards Rust at times. What's your take on the whole quote unquote language war between those two?
The to your original question about like the ngrok JavaScript SDK, it is the ngrok Rust SDK that I was talking about earlier is really the core, and the JavaScript SDK is a set of bindings that wrap the Rust core.
Gotcha. Yep.
Um, So we did that for a number of reasons. One of them being like fewer implementations to maintain, also performance reasons, things like that. And we're going to be blogging about that and talking a little bit more about it publicly. So you'll be able to get a good sense of like why we built it the way we did. My take on like Go versus Rust is you know uh, they're both great languages. They both solve problems really well. I'm not much of a like competing technologies kind of person. Uh, there are there are ways in which one or the other might be more suitable to a particular problem. The best some of the best advice that I ever got about picking a programming language for a particular problem is at the end of the day, one of the things that you're most short on is time. And so the thing that is that you are most comfortable with or that you have the most resources to solve in your network is often like a really good choice. um, there are definitely places where either of them like leans more strongly to solving particular types of applications if you have unlimited time and unlimited resources and the ability to really dive in and like leverage each of them to their extent. But um, I don't have a particularly strong take on either on like a language war. I think thinking about it in like that kind of competitive way is not really the way I like to think about
I wanted a
technology.
controversial opinion.
I'm so
So you
sorry.
d-
Yeah. No, we're all builders. Like,
yes,
yeah, like we should be
a
thinking about
craftsman
those
doesn't
things
blame his
that,
tools. I get what you're saying. Yep.
yeah, we should be thinking about the ways that we're all like unified in like building great software.
Tell me about webhooks, FYI. Obviously, webhooks are, you know, always on your mind at ngrok. And I think for a lot of developers, webhooks are a bit of a different animal. They're like, "What is this? I don't get it." Did you guys create this to provide guidance and a resource for developers to learn about webhooks?
So fun fact about the genesis of this, webhooks, you're right, is really core to ngrok, right? It's where we started, right? When we go back to the beginning of this conversation, we were talking about, what was ngrok's genesis, and it was like receiving Twilio webhooks and like sending those text messages over and over again. One of the primitives that we wanted to offer to developers, right, was since webhooks is something that's really core to what ngrok does, and one of the ways that many developers use ngrok is to receive webhooks, is webhooks have the majority of them have a security mechanism baked into them, which is that the webhooks are signed in some way. And so we wanted to make that easier. Just like we talked about putting OAuth in front of your applications, we wanted to put webhook signature validation in front of your applications so that if you were exposing a webhook consumer to the internet, you could tell ngrok, I'm expecting GitHub webhooks or Slack webhooks or Twilio webhooks, and you give us the signing key, and we will guarantee that the only thing your application receives are valid signed webhooks from that provider, right? So this is an important security mechanism. So as we built that out, we basically we built out over 60 of these different signature mechanisms. And the crazy thing about doing it is you see like the complete lack of standardization around how everyone does them, right? There are, for 60 providers, there are, pretty close to 60 ways to do all of them. That's an exaggeration, but you'll forgive me and take the point here. And so really, as we were doing that, we said like, wow, we should really like document this for the community. Like, how is everyone like thinking about webhooks? What are the different mechanisms that people have used? Because there are some folks who have like explored in one direction and other folks who have explored in other ones that are really interesting. So to make that concrete, you know, some folks have really thought about how to do zero downtime rotation of signatures, right? Of like, if you change your signing key, how do you make sure that like the webhook consumer doesn't break? Or if the provider wants to change their signing algorithm, how do you do that in a way that the webhook doesn't break? Um, if you want to like add an additional parameters, there's lots of like different ways that you can change these around. There are some folks some providers that are actively thinking about signing without a symmetric key, actually signing with like an asymmetric key where they keep the private key and you keep the public key, right? Which prevents an attack where, like, if it's symmetric keys, technically, if someone gets a hold of your key, they could start signing webhooks to you, but in the asymmetric case, they can't. So there's a lot of diversity in this sphere, and it makes it really challenging to integrate with them all, right? Some providers have invested in building libraries dedicated to you that you can import into your code, but some haven't. Some don't have the resources to do that, or maybe they haven't supported your particular language first. So we wanted to really build a language independent way that allowed developers to get this kind of security in a really, really easy fashion. And Webhooks.fyi was really born out of like building that and like learning all this and wanting to share it back to the community.
One of the things that often comes to mind is what are we doing around standardization? I noticed that you listed cloud events. That's something that came across my radar. I know that this is still, and this is the thing that always irks me when I'm a developer, still under active development. We've replaced the under construction GIF that we used to put everywhere on websites with this is under active development. That's all you need is the person with the pickaxe when you're looking at developer standards and specifications. It's very frustrating, but you read the spec around something like cloud events, for example, and you're like, wow, this sounds great. Yes, this makes a lot of sense to me. And then you read later on, like, no one supports it. It's still under active development. There's still conversations going on. So I think you're right. I think that the standardization efforts around this are, while should be applauded and credited where they are, it's still incredibly frustrating just to have to wait for all this to happen. Is that your experience as well?
It's definitely a very fragmented ecosystem. Like I said earlier, diversity in implementations. We haven't really seen much of a anything around standardization that's really taken hold in the industry yet. When you like look at all the providers that we integrated with, there are, one of the most standard ways to do this is like doing an HMAC SHA-256 of the webhook contents, but what exactly you run through that signature algorithm actually like varies wildly. Like some folks, it's just the body, others pull some headers into it. And so even that is not standardized, even though it appears to be. So I would love to see standardization in this world, and our hope is that Webhooks FYI really like that survey of like what are all of the different folks doing helps provide a ground for folks who want to engage in those standardization efforts to like have a good survey of like what's actually happening out there in the world, because it's usually one of the first steps in standardization is understanding how is the industry actually solving this problem in the real world right now.
What's your guidance for developers? And fair enough if you don't want to look into the crystal ball, but what does your gut tell you where you think we're headed? Where would you say developers focus their attention on just tracking in terms of, because that's how I do it. I just track what I feel is going to be the reality, and I watch Twitter and other social media streams, and you start to see a lot of momentum around certain specs versus others. There's the ones that we've had forever, and then there's the ones that are coming on board. What's your sense of where things are going?
I don't know that I want to look into the crystal ball there. I guess like what I would say is like developers shouldn't have to think about this problem. Like the
Yes.
problem of like how does one provider like secure their messages to another like shouldn't be a thing that application developers are thinking about. Um, it's one of those cases where you really want to get back to being focused on building your application, like the thing that like provides value to you or your customers, whatever stakeholders you have. That's really why we built ngrok, right? Is like why we created that webhook verification piece of it, is that we'll think about those problems, and application developers should not have to.
I was just going to say that's your sales pitch. Just hold your head and just say, "Look, just use ngrok and you'll be fine." That's all you have to do.
Yeah.
So, what does the future hold for ngrok? Where do you guys where are you looking for your next innovation? What are customers asking for? What are we've talked a little bit, is it the language integrations that you're building out next? Are there any things that you're tracking right now that are catching your attention? Where does the future of ngrok what does the future of ngrok look like?
ngrok is, we are an ingress as a service platform. Like our goal is to make it, that the easiest thing to like get your application to production and online is to wrap ngrok around it, right? Like wrap those superpowers around it. And so all of our, innovation is focused on that goal of making it easy for developers, to get their applications online securely. And that goes beyond just like what can we offload from developers' plates, like auth and resiliency. It goes into observability of like allowing developers to see the traffic that's going through, and it extends to other departments of like how do we make sure that developers are always like putting their applications on the internet in a secure way? Like how do we give security like the observability and control to allow them to set the correct policies? that developers can reuse to get their applications online correctly and securely. So all of that is just about ngrok being a way to get your applications online securely and quickly, and get you back to building your application code.
Fantastic. Yeah, I think is extremely powerful. I think if you're a developer doing anything with networking, and let's face it, who isn't? You owe it to yourself to check out ngrok. I think it helps shorten your development cycles. I think it's a wonderful tool, and it's certainly a part of the arsenal of tools that I use in my toolbox. So, Alan, thanks for explaining to me some of the things that ngrok is doing. It looks wonderful. I can't wait to see some of the libraries and integrations you're doing, and I'll definitely keep close tabs on this in the future.
Thanks so much for having me on, John. It was a pleasure talking with you.